First up will be Keith Sellen. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He served 22 years in the Army, the last 16 as a judge advocate, during which he served in Korea and Germany, as well as on the faculty of West Point, teaching constitutional law and military law. He's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin Law School and the Army Judge Advocate General School, at the latter of which his studies focused on public international law. Some of you know that these days he serves with distinction as director of the Office of Lawyer Regulation, the agency responsible for the professional regulation of lawyers who are licensed in this state.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good to be here this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you. And I'm assuming this will go off real soon. But I'll keep talking louder and louder until it does. And hopefully we'll get it rectified right away. There, that sounds a little better. At least I'm getting some feedback on my mic, but good. I am very grateful for the opportunity to go back and revisit a prior life of mine a little bit because of my time as an Army Judge Advocate. It's been 14 years since I've been able to think about that and talk about that, so I'm very grateful to be here with you this morning. As Peter mentioned, I am a Wisconsin native, and I've kind of been around the world and raised my children as we traveled around the world, only to find that my daughter has returned to teach at my old small high school north of Green Bay. So we have kind of an interesting way of seeing the world, she and I, a little bit differently. But I like things that are simple. And so what I'm trying to do is to take something that's extraordinarily complex and in 40 minutes lay it out in something that's simple. I'm not satisfied that I have done an adequate job yet, but I am hopeful that I have done something that will be useful and interesting to you. So we'll proceed along those lines, and we'll see how it goes. But one more thing before we do that. I mean, we have spent a week here in Milwaukee honoring someone who is a great soldier and someone with a significant impact on the legal system, and it relates to my experience as a JAG, because that's what judge advocates do. We are the interface in the military operation between the military force and the authority of the commander and the Constitution and the rule of law. And that's where we find ourselves. And we're torn in both directions all the time, and we try to reconcile them in a way that is meaningful. So what comes from my presentation today is something that has been ingrained into the DNA of a lot of JAGs, and it's something that became my indoctrination, and something, of course, then that flows through and follows through that. So let me see, are we good? There we go. So we'll talk about a constitution building model. Now, we've had a lot of good discussion and very enlightening for me about what goes into this process. I wanted to take just a quick step back and ask ourselves the question, what is a constitution? We see it differently in different contexts. We even see it in different ways as we'll talk about what is the American Constitution. We think of it as different things. But in Great Britain, as you may know, there's not a written document, but they have a constitution. It's older than our own, much, much older than our own, and it seems to work very, very well. In the United States, we have a written constitution, but as we know, with a written document, we have to interpret that, and we certainly recognize that today we interpret certain portions of that Constitution differently than we did at an earlier time in our history. The Interstate Commerce Clause means something completely different today than it meant in the 1830s, right? The 14th Amendment means something completely different today than it meant in 1897. The right of privacy means something completely different today than it meant prior to 1972. And we all know that, and we like that. Jefferson, I think, had even a more liberal view of how this would be interpreted. In his writings, he said that every generation had the inherent right to write their own constitution, and suggested that every 34 years that ought to be done. Well, we've never gone quite that far, but we have gone to some extent in a way to do that. So that for what it is. Russia has had a written constitution since the time, at least, of Nicholas II. And we'll take a look at a small portion of that in a little bit. And so they have a written document, but we recognize that the Constitution as a document and the Constitution as interpreted also might mean something else. It might mean how we implement it in day-to-day life. And what is it as a living and breathing legal culture in our country and in our state or other area. Bosnia is kind of interesting because the Constitution in Bosnia-Herzegovina from December of 1995, as I understand it to this day, are the Dayton Accords, which were drafted in Dayton, Ohio, and included participation by the three entities we'll talk about, still exists. It's still managed through an international presence in Bosnia, but it's got nothing to do with the kinds of things we're familiar with when we talk about the Constitution. It's very, very sketchy, provides a process for development, but it really doesn't define the things that we're used to seeing when we talk about constitutions. Okay. What I've tried to do is to go through my experience and give you some sense of what might go into the idea of how do we build, how do we move forward in any situation that relates to a constitution. And my thoughts come from a master's thesis that I wrote in 1992, which is quite well dated and vastly undercited, but still I think has some good practical application for us. And authorities upon which I relied certainly are worthy, and we'll see that they have a broader acceptance than just what something I did a long time ago. But we're looking at some ideas of unity. How do we develop unity in a country? And what are the options there? We can move towards a greater sense of unity. We can move towards a sense of fragmentation or separation or calving away of different entities. And then we have to struggle with what are the things that cause and can develop unity, what are the things that cause disunity, and I think we kind of know from our common sense what some of those things are that divide us. And so that's an easy idea. We know that unity can come from really a couple different things. We know that we can coerce it, and so when we look at what goes on in some countries, we see that the will is imposed, and the discussion about Japan, I think, is very relevant to this discussion because of what happened in World War II and the fact that the Constitution then is something that was developed in light of the United States coming into a conquered nation that had unconditionally surrendered. Obviously, we want to promote some stability and promote respect for the rule of law. So we want to move from a society that is really based in coercive measures into one that's based in just a matter of, yes, the respect for this legal basis and this legal organization is earned, and we all buy into it, and we're happy to live under it and resolve our disputes under it. So it's not the old Wild West that we're looking for. It's something that's more cultured and normal and civilized and respectful and legal we're looking at. So a couple other ideas there we'll talk about as we go through. So what is unity? Well, if you look in the dictionary, that's a good definition, commitment to a common purpose. What does it mean in my family of 7 brothers and sisters? What does it mean in my neighborhood and then when I'm before the school board arguing about what's going on in school? What does it mean in my county government where my father served for 22 years on the county board? What does unity mean? What does it mean in the state of Wisconsin? I remember as a kid when Winneconne was trying to secede from the state. A very interesting time watching the news every night. What does it mean when the American experiment goes into the Civil War? And what does it mean when the United Nations is trying to do something in Korea or even much more recently in Ukraine? But what we have are these different entities who all have interests, who all have objectives, and who are living in connection with each other. And they have risks, and they have goals that they want to achieve. And so we have different insecurities, as you can read from the Federalist, that affect how we are going to act. And some of these risks will create some common interests upon which we can capitalize to develop some unity. So it's really important, in my mind, to think about what are those things that unite us, and why do they unite us, and then how can we move on that? And the concept here is to promote unity in one or two ways, and preferably a combination of two ways. Coercion is obviously the employment of force. We have a moral commitment. We can have a legal commitment. We can have a police commitment. We can have a paramilitary commitment. And we can have a complete military commitment. All these things work together, but they're not alone. We can have political measures that work. We can use economic measures that work. All different kinds of forces that we can use to coerce what we want to do to achieve unity. It can also be used to promote disunity, right? Because we had the experience from Professor DeMarco about how the Democratic South was responding to the Reconstruction constitutional efforts of General Grant. So it can go in either direction, and depending upon what your objectives are, if you don't respect the rule of law, you may have some benefit from this lecture too. I don't know. So, okay, legitimacy means we earn respect. Do we have an honest broker, decision maker, who's going to resolve the disputes in some way that makes sense and is acceptable to everyone? Because what happens in any conflict, if it's riding to school in the car with my 7 brothers and sisters, and we're in the back seat of the car, and I bump up against my sister, and my elbow catches her in the rib. She goes, "Dad, he's touching me." Well, there are 7 in the back seat. Of course he's touching me. And the world is so integrated that that's going on all the time. You can't see what's going on in Crimea without understanding that there are Russians who live here. There are Ukrainians who live here. You can't live in Bosnia for 10 minutes without realizing that there's a Croat here, there's a Serb here, there's a Muslim here, and we all do things together all the time. And we have these things that divide us, but we also have to find what these common interests are that unite us. So we need someone there who can help us deal with this idea that he hit me first. And I'm just responding because I need to protect my interests and my insecurities and to accomplish my objectives. And someone to mediate all that. So, okay. Now, these ideas were not new when I wrote a master's thesis in 1992. I mean, there's all kinds of data on this from a lot of people who have studied systems throughout centuries. So Himmelman is really a good guy who put all this together in a good book that I have at the end of my slides I can give you later if you're interested, in the history of peace solutions throughout the ages. Really an excellent, excellent book. And so he lists several of these things that we can go back and take a look at. All of these plans for peace, for providing some stability and respect for the rule of law, have these 3 elements of unity, coercion, and legitimacy in them. All of them do. So Dubois, Frenchman in 1306, Federation, the Council of Judges. So the Federation is this idea that there'll be some form of unity. Council of Judges provide the legitimacy and concerted military action against aggressors, coercion. Dante, right, the Inferno. World government, unity, an emperor, autocrat. And he would settle disputes and suppress tyrannies, coercion. All that's in there. I mean, he's thinking about how to do this. American Crusade, 1623. An assembly, a little bit different form of government, but the similar idea of unity. Resolves disputes and enforces decisions. So the resolving is the legitimacy part, and the enforcement is the coercion part. Hugo Grotius, the father of international law, same idea. Even a less unified form of central government. Conferences we're going to have now, and actually, we had international conferences for a long time before we moved to something called the League of Nations in 1920. The Grotius model was something we used for many, many centuries. And again, a unity in terms of the conferences. Disinterested states would decide, a little bit different than our UN Security Council veto right now, because sometimes the states with the veto are interested states, and the veto's still good. So an issue of legitimacy there. They enforce peace. And so there's this idea of coercion. And Rousseau, similar idea with the European Federation. One of the interesting things about constitutions, we'll see in just a minute, is they can relate to a lot of different forms of government. We talk a lot about democracy, and certainly that's an important thing that we as Americans hold to, and we try to teach other countries or use our influence to do that. John Norton Moore is a very distinguished professor at UVA who has written and spoken about the rule of law, and he calls it rule of law engagement. And it's an American idea that he has developed and promotes to help other countries develop the rule of law. And so some of my thoughts are inspired by his. So let's take this model and talk in a very simplistic diagram. I'm fearful of diagrams because they may help you understand or see some changes in things, but they also might just confuse you beyond their usefulness, so I'm hoping I'm not doing that. But in MacArthur in Japan, what I'm looking at in 1945 is there's a great deal of unity in Japan in 1945, right? A great deal of unity in Japan in 1945. Why? Because they have unconditionally surrendered, the Americans are in full control, and the atomic bomb has been dropped twice. In William Manchester's book, he relates a story about some of MacArthur's aides going to see a Japanese public official negotiating some work in the government. And this official was there, but he had a secretary tell MacArthur's aides, he's busy and I'll see them in a little while. Of course, the aides were unhappy. They were offended by the idea that they would not be warmly received. And so MacArthur's aide said to the secretary, just tell the minister that that's fine. We will just stay here and enjoy his nuclear sunshine. And they were promptly admitted into the minister's office to conduct their business. So yeah, there's a great deal of unity. There's also a great deal of unity in the terms of the influence of the emperor. And one of the great things about how the emperor was that I gathered, Professor Moore, from you and from some of the other things that I've read, there's a great deal of value here in MacArthur using the legitimacy of the emperor to gain unity with the Japanese. And so there is a moral persuasion here as well as a military persuasion that relates to this as I look at this. Now, this is 1945, and just very simplistically, by 1950, the Constitution is in place. There are some important reforms regarding suffrage, and women's suffrage in particular, and land reform, and many other things which we don't have time to talk about. But there is a movement in the picture in Japan towards unity that is still very good, but for different reasons, because there are steps that have been taken to get buy-in, and it's not something that was a simple process. It was a very difficult, time-consuming process, but it moved from something that was purely based on coercion to something that moved toward more legitimacy. And the bottom slide, there are two words, coercion on the left and legitimacy on the right, are part of the continuum there, which I don't think are showing up very well on my slide. I apologize for that. Okay. Let's move on to a couple different places where we might look at how this goes. In Russia, we have a country that is completely disunified. There are dozens of languages, many nationalities. They had 15 republics in the Soviet system, and even within them there were different areas, different religions, strong polarization between the influence of China and the influence of the West, and all kind of. They had a constitution under the Tsar. You can see one of the articles there, 59, which was the title of the Tsar. And if you forgive me for just diverging back to West Point for a while, some of you may be familiar with the Beast Barracks, and you go there, and so some firstie will come up to you and say, "What's your name, mister?" So I can just imagine myself in some kind of a sadistic dream thinking that, well, I'm the son of Nicholas, and I went to West Point, and some firstie's locking my heels and saying, "What is your name, mister?" And so I start to go through this litany. Well, by the grace of God, I'm Tsar of all the Russias, et cetera, et cetera. And then when I get to this phrase at the end, which is actually in the Constitution, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth, I imagine that the firstie would probably be a little bit miffed, and I'd be doing some push-ups or subject to some other rigorous hazing. But that's kind of an interesting thing. Every communist constitution in Russia had civil rights for individuals like these. Every single one. Written in the Constitution. You know what? Lenin gave women the right to vote before they had it in the United States. It's close, but Lenin won. Well, on the other hand, I do have a cynical side. I think, yes, but they had to cast their vote in a particular way, I suppose, in the interest of the Soviet state. So what difference did it make? On the other hand, the Constitution also contained significant limitations on it. So you had to exercise these rights in a way that was consistent with the security and the interests of the local Soviet and the Supreme Soviet. And so the courts in Russia would be interpreting these two clauses and trying to make some sense of what are, in practical application, completely inconsistent concepts. And we know how that worked out in our experience there in Russia. So this is going on from 1917 to the early 1980s. And then we get Brezhnev's death, Andropov's short tenure, and then Mikhail Gorbachev. And he starts a process of moving the society in a different direction. We all remember the phrases perestroika and glasnost, and what that meant for the democratization and the privatization of their economy. And so his vision of what he saw at that point, he describes for you here. So when he comes to power in about 1985-ish, I think he's there in our scale. Yes, there's a lot of unity in the Soviet Union, a lot of it, and it's coercive. It's coercive. And despite what the Constitution says, life is what it is. So some things happen after 1985, and you know, I'm a military guy, so I might lean towards the military rationale. I think there are two reasons why we won the Cold War. I think one is the significant influence of human rights throughout the world, particularly as it migrated from Western Europe into Eastern Europe. And you'll remember when the wall came down, that's kind of what started the breakdown going on in the Soviet Union. It went from west to east, as we look at the chronology of events during that significant time frame. The other reason, I give credit to President Reagan and many others, is Star Wars. We established a military superiority over the Russians, which checkmated them. And it created the circumstances where they could not keep pace anymore, and their system was breaking down, and they had to change. They had to change. So which of these two is more important? I don't think it's really an important question. I think they both had some influence on it, and that creates the situation where Gorbachev has to do something different. So he tells you what he wanted to do. And I remember when this was going on thinking, this guy's got to be crazy, because every communist leader in Russia would want to preserve power till the time he died or be killed, and then pass it on to whoever stands up in the wall of the Kremlin, you know, on the far right during his passing dirge in Lenin in Red Square. So he's going to lose his head, I'm thinking, in 1988, 1989, because he's talking about democratization, he's talking about privatization. It disrupts the entire order of things over there, and it can't be successful. It's interesting in 2009 to see that despite the fact that he no longer retained leadership of that country, he considers himself successful in what he did. I think it's a credit to the character of a great man. This was his goal. He wanted to move from unity based on a lot of coercion to unity based on a lot of legitimacy. The great thing about this model is maybe we can get some idea of where to put a star on a chart. Help us visualize what we see. The bad thing about this model is it doesn't tell us how to get from point A to point B. Maybe we can find out where point B ought to be, and then we can think, well, how can we think of some ways to improve unity, or to kind of work on some things with legitimacy, or to prevent some fragmentation, things like that, but not much more. Yeah, he went too fast. Yeah, he did too much. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe there needed to be a transition. But what happened in this process of moving towards legitimacy is they lost a lot of unity, because the Russians were starting to understand what personal autonomy meant. They were starting to understand what their own individuality meant. and respect for it meant. They started to think a lot more freely and courageously for themselves. And so that created a lot of issues then with 200 languages, 15 republics, at least 3 religions, major religions, and tension between Western ideas and Eastern ideas, and just impossible to keep together. Could he have done a better job? Well, I couldn't have done a better job, no doubt about that. Maybe he would say, I don't know. But this is where he wound up, with a lot more legitimacy, people liking the ideas of privatization, liking the ideas of free conscience, liking the ideas of being able to go anywhere you want, do whatever you want. But he lost control of the Soviet Union and it disintegrated. It just fragmented completely apart. There's some talk today about, with what's going on in Ukraine and Crimea, that it might start to rebuild itself as more than just a Russian state, not the old Soviet state, but more so. Well, in 1991, when it fell, they went through a process in Russia where they were trying now to create a new Russian constitution. And you may remember the pictures of Yeltsin standing on the tank in Moscow at the Russian Federation Capitol building with his defiant stand. And there was a crisis there of disunity in Russia, and the military was very assertive during that time period. And Yeltsin exercised and displayed some great courage in pulling this together. But they put together a constitution in 1993, which exists to this day, for Russia. It's interesting to see how things have passed since then. Putin became the leader of Russia not too long after the Yeltsin era ended. And there's been, I'm just going to show you some quotations from individuals who've analyzed that. But what essentially is going on here is that Putin early on needed some legitimacy, so he was very happy to rely on the constitutional authority that existed there for him to do that. And as long as he needed it, it's good. But since then, we'll see things have changed. So in his early years, letting the courts decide cases, respecting civil rights, and being open and accommodating to the interests of others, that sounds great. But more recently, there have been some other concerns that have arisen. And the Amnesty International information is quite extensive about what's going on over there. So there have been laws that have been passed limiting some of the rights that are expressly contained in the Constitution. Very interesting idea, one that doesn't resonate well with those of us who've read Marbury versus Madison, who understand that the Supreme Court can declare laws to be unconstitutional and unenforceable. So a little bit different idea right here going on. And so where he has come is somewhat down, where that star was further along the respect for rule of law line, and is starting to move back down. And I think a little bit more toward coercion, because they're actually using legal coercion in the forms of these laws to limit rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution. So that's kind of an interesting idea. It's kind of a left-handed application of my thoughts. Moving on to Ukraine a little bit, we know that there's a lot of recent news there, and so I wanted to talk to you about that. But before I do that, I want to tell you my source. The lady who cuts my hair is from Crimea. Her parents still live there. She has no idea I'm here today, but she cut my hair on Tuesday and talked to me long before and long after she was finished about what's going on with her parents and what's going on over there. And so my thoughts are tainted pretty much by the person who cuts my hair. I trust anybody who cuts my hair, right? I got to tell you just for a second, one of my military trials was defending a young soldier who had done some terrible things, stealing money from everybody. And he was a bad person. And he got convicted and sent to Fort Leavenworth for 6 years. And a couple of years later, after this was all done, I was at Fort Leavenworth. And I said, I'm going to go get a haircut. I need a haircut. Well, the barber is actually manned by inmates. So I thought, I think I'm going to go off post to get my haircut. Who knows whether I'll run into Frank at the barber shop today, and I didn't want to take that chance. But I always trust the person who cuts my hair. Well, Ukraine is one of these places, too, where there's a significant combination and integration of Ukrainians and Russians and some other ethnic groups. And it's really an interesting place. They have affinities for Moscow. They have affinities for Western Europe. And according to my hair stylist, they have an affinity for corruption. So, so away we go. So 5 years ago, when the economic problems hit here, and they kind of hit some other places in the world, and they hit Ukraine, Yanukovych takes over. He actually changes the constitution, goes back to an older version of the Ukrainian constitution, and then starts to abuse his authority and collect all kinds of things. The pictures on the internet of his house are astounding. I don't let my wife look at them for fear she'll want me to earn a living such that I'll be able to purchase something like that, which would be impossible for me. And he got in a pickle because he was trying to get some economic help from both the West and Russia, and he was looking really, playing all the options, but then he ended up in a pickle because depending upon the one he chose, people weren't going to like him. I think he's got a problem no matter which way it goes. And he sided with Russia, and he was ousted. And so shortly after that, the Russian government annexes Crimea. But they're also rebuilding Crimea. And this is information from my hairstylist. Yanukovych was taking money from different districts in Ukraine, she tells me, for Kiev, for the central government, to do things in districts like build schools, build hospitals. Takes the money, the schools don't get built. The hospitals don't get built. We know where the money goes. The Russians, after annexing Crimea, have invested a great deal of money building schools, building hospitals, and they're going up. So when you think about legitimacy and how to promote unity, you can see that Russia is taking some steps to promote unity and loyalty from Crimea in terms of their economic development, where the Kiev government was not. So, since unity is unity with whom, right? Good, very interesting. So 5 years ago, economic trouble, basically good government, not too awful bad. Now, a lot less respect for the rule of law. There's no unity. There's infighting throughout the entire eastern half of the country. It's not terribly severe. We know that the Russians are involved in it. We know that the Ukrainians are involved in it. We know it's very difficult for Western Europe and the United States to be effectively involved in it. That's where I think we are in a simple picture. Moving on to Bosnia, I think I got about 5 minutes. Bosnia is a country that is comprised of several ethnic groups, different races. There are 3 major religions. The only real period of peace they have had during the last century were under Tito. It's a very strange place. I went to the International War Crimes Tribunal in 1997 and saw the trial of the first war criminal tried. His name was Duško Tadić. He was a karate teacher in Bosnia. The witnesses against him were the kids in his karate class. They had gotten along great under Tito and had a wonderful community, but when things fell apart, when Tito died, and the ethnic strife and the religious strife inflamed, the karate teacher was actually torturing these now grown men in a prison camp. And he killed some of them, and I saw one testify against him in The Hague. How does that happen? There's tremendous forces of disunity. The things that divide us are visceral, strong. And how do we deal with that? There's almost, there is another place where it's this strong. We all know that there may be others, but it's extraordinarily strong here, very strong here. So what do we do about it? First of all, in 1995, we see a situation that is really terrible. You cannot walk in Bosnia without knowing where the landmines are. Remember pictures of Princess Di going through the country and trying to develop some support for cleaning this up. You can stand on the banks of the Sava River in Croatia and look across to Bosnia. It's night and day in 1995. The Croatian buildings in Slovanski Brod are fine. They're up, they're functioning, they're intact, the windows are good. Across the river, 200 feet away, they're all bombed out. There's not a window in a building. Streets are all torn up. There's nothing going on. 3 armies, 1 million men, right? 1 million refugees, economies in shambles. In December of 1995, we go in with 60,000 troops from NATO and significant American commitment in that force. The first commander to cross the bridge in Slavonski Brod into Serbia is greeted by a bunch of officials who stop him and say, "What is your authority to come into our country?" And this colonel, to his great credit, points to the tank behind him and says, "This is my passport." And he was admitted without incident. No unity, no respect for the rule of law. I don't know if there's any coercion there either, so my picture isn't perfect by any means. The solution is the Dayton Accords. So what we did is we created what I would loosely call a Swiss confederation. It's not really the same at all, but it does recognize there are going to be three interests here. They're all going to be managed, and we're going to try to move forward to develop a better constitution. Not just a document, but a way of living under the rule of law. What happens in the next 10 years? Instead of 3 armies, we've got 1. Instead of 1 million soldiers, we've got 10,000. Half those who were displaced have returned. The NATO force is down from 60 to 7,000, and Bosnia-Herzegovina is still intact as a country. It has not been annexed at that point in time. The economy is good, and that's really important to note because it changes shortly thereafter. So that's Bosnia in 2005. Yes, we've got some coercion. Yeah, we're building some legitimacy, and people are not killing each other anymore after dinner at night. It's refreshing. It's refreshing. So some lessons learned. We need a security strategy. We just can't do one thing at a time. We have to integrate legitimacy. We have to integrate it with coercion, and we have to do something in a way that manages the situation well and moves us forward. International cooperation is a big deal. Local influence over the entities, the individuals, the leaders in those local levels, very important. A very significant civil affairs involvement in Bosnia, probably the largest we have ever had in any country and for the longest period of time. And Professor DeMarco was talking about how all that works, really important. But since 2005, things have not moved forward there. So we've had some stagnation. I don't want to overestimate the importance of the economy, but I'm going to anyway, because I think it's got a lot to do with the economy. Things were going well. I would have thought at that point in time we would capitalize on the idea that there would be a unifying interest in economic well-being. But it's amazing what I will do to my economic detriment if these other things that are important to me take control of my thinking. So we have had some backwards movement here. So I think it's moving maybe a little bit down the respect for rule of law slide since then. Okay. Summarize in 2 minutes, I think we'll be good. We have to think about constitutional development as something that is more than the text of the document. The text of the document is really important, and as a lawyer, I think it's really important. As a soldier, I think this other stuff's important too. If we want it to work, it's got to be something that is meaningful, acceptable, and implemented. What I'm proposing to you is not something I'm trying to sell you. I mean, if this helps you think about and helps you understand something, great. If it doesn't, I'm sorry I wasted your time. It's interesting to me, but I think we can look at some problems that are presented and at least get a sense for what we see. And maybe we can then get an idea of where maybe we'd like to go, but I have no idea how we get there unless we look at that particular situation and think in a multidisciplinary approach about what to do. There's always going to be coercion and legitimacy involved. There's never a completely coercive environment. Somebody's going to rebel. Even then, there's never going to be a completely legitimate environment because I can walk down the streets of Milwaukee in a very good place where I feel generally safe, and somebody's behavior may need to be controlled. Maybe it'll be mine. As we look to some of these countries, I think, well, Russia may have some issues if they don't regain some balance with their civil rights. and if they don't deal with some of the issues that relate to corruption in Ukraine, there'll be a lack of legitimacy that may continue in Ukraine. That's their big challenge. In Bosnia, we've got a starting point that we really need to capitalize on because we haven't in the last 10 years. And maybe it's because we don't pay attention to it, but if we don't pay attention to it from the outside, it's not going to resolve itself from the inside. Just the nature of the passions there are too great to be left to themselves. Okay, I got some sources there. I'll be happy to talk to you about any of that at whatever point we get a chance to talk. I'm going to turn it over, but I just want to thank you before I do that for your very kind attention. It's good to be here.
Thank you. As I listen to the presentations, I see that there's a tension between short-term political or economic interest and the long-term gain of a nation. Can you share with us, based upon your experience and expertise, some guiding principles or concepts to try to move the various factions as described in your respective presentations, moving from that short-term gain to that long-term development of a common interest?
Thank you for that question. That's a question that my presentation does not answer. But I think it's the question that should be answered by it. When we're talking about short-term and long-term interests, I think what you want to do is to take steps in the direction of a long-term solution and provide some stability. We see that a lot of the short-term problems can be resolved if you have a long-term perspective on things. So you have to get to some of the base ideas that relate to this. And we try to do this in a lot of different ways, whether it's through international organizations or through political entities, states, countries, and whether we do it through our U.S. military command system in different countries and civil affairs, or we do it through non-government private organizations. But we're looking to find ways to improve some things that I think we see as beneficial in the long run. And I'm talking about intellectual development. I'm talking about education. I'm looking at things we try to do for economic development and some sense of trying to help individuals see how their lives can be better. And I mean, Brady used hope of a hope, and we're trying to move in that direction, seeing that if we can ignite some passions and get some people interested and buy in and see how we do that in a particular country, then we can see some progress. We do it in a good way in many countries, and sometimes we lose interest in those countries. And so we have to have, I think, a system that is globally a little bit more comprehensive in managing how we do that. The short-term solution is something that we look to for political reasons as well as the political reasons that exist in a short-term situation in a particular country. We've got to move past that with a longer-term view. It's hard in the political environment. It's hard in the global economic environment, but I see us moving in that direction more and more as we see more legitimization of international organizations and more commitment to cooperation among countries, particularly as we see the leaders in the Western world, and even more so as I see the development of the Far East, and I see an increasing influence of China in particular, but with Japan and other countries. We're looking at some economic ties and relationships that I expect are going to help us be a little bit more stable and take a little bit longer term view than we've had in the